Hello everyone, welcome back to another series. In this particular series, we are going to learn a little bit more about the transformers, the building blocks of current LLMs and the natural language processing and the generation space. So in this series particularly, we will be going over through one of the very good detailed blog written by Jay Alamar. I'll like to really thank him for writing such a great deep dive blog into this thing. So in this particular series, we are going to discuss and deep dive into the transformers, its architecture, and how everything is working under the hood. And for that, we'll be taking the reference from the blog written by the JLMR for the illustrated transformer. So, just on a very high level overview, if we have a certain problem in which what we are trying to do is machine translation for translating one of the input sentences that we have, for example, maybe it can be from Spanish or some language, just as estudiants, and then using the transformer to translate that particular sentence to English. In that particularly, we're trying to find, say that it means I am a student. Oh, that's great. And everything is done by the transformer. So if we try to understand what exactly a transformer is, it's nothing but an architecture built on top of encoders and decoders block, encoders and decoders component, in which particularly here in a normal transformer, the Spanish or the French sentence that we have is given as an input to the encoder block, and then encoder process that particular input sentence and gives certain semi-formatted outputs, which are then fed into decoders. Then decoders process those outputs and then finally give us a sentence back in English. I am a student. Particularly, that is what's happening on the high level. However, now let's deep dive into what exactly are these encoders and decoders component doing. So, by the way in which I referred to the encoders and decoders, uh, I'll say the component that I was saying, mentioning earlier, the encoder, it was a component. That particular component comprises of a stack of encoders, and similarly, the decoders comprise a set of decoders. And particularly now, if you try to understand what we were doing is for the sentence that we had, we are passing that sentence to the encoder component, and through that encoder component, we are passing process output to decoder, and then decoder is finally outputting the English sentence. And now let's see what each of these encoder components is doing. So for the encoder we had, let's try to understand that it's divided into two major set of layers or components, in which the first layer that we have is the self-attention layer, which is based on one of the attention methods devised by Ashish Vaswani, and attention is another's for the attention is what you need paper. And in that particularly, what we were doing is for the input that we have, we pass that input to self-attention layer. The output of that particular layer is passed into feed-forward neural network. And this particular output we pass on further. Maybe we can give this thing as an output after processing, or maybe we can pass this output to the decoder block that we have. And now, particularly seeing into what's generally happening above was that we are having one encoder block and one decoder block, in which we are passing the words that we had in Spanish or French to the self-attention layer, and that particular thing is processed by the feed forward layer, and then finally given to us as an output. And secondly, that particular output that we got is also passed to the decoder block that we had. In decoder block, we pass the English sentence that we had to tell, like this is the output that we want. Then that output is processed and passed to self-attention layer, then to echo. Then that particular the output of the encoder and the self-attention layer of decoder is passed to encoder decoder attention layer, and then finally everything is passed to feed forward layer for further processing, and then we finally get the output. So because this is uh, in this particularly we are going to do deep dive into the architecture and the working of transformers. So it will be a multi-session series, and in this particular in segment of the series, we learned about on a very high level how a transformer is particularly divided into two parts, encoder and decoder, and how each, what do we exactly mean by each encoder block or each decoder block, and what each of this encoder decoder block has come the components that they have at a very high level. Now, in the next session, we will dive deeper into how we converting the inputs, then particularly what encoding we are doing, how exactly we are doing for words, the different words we have different sentences, and then trying to see the attention that we have and what do we mean exactly by that. So with this, let's stop off here and we will continue further in the next session.